Good afternoon. My name is Kim Schoenholtz, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the 18th NYU Stern Economic and Market Outlook Forum. The host of today's forum is the Stern Center for Global Economy and Business, which serves the university through outreach to the broader community, including the academic, business, and policy worlds, as well as students and alumni. We're pleased today to have in the audience students and faculty from all over NYU, as well as many alums. Thank you very much for joining us. Today's session will last up to 90 minutes. It will begin with presentations of 5 to 10 minutes by each of the panelists about economic and market prospects, followed by audience Q&A. We'll finish by 6:30 p.m. For the Q&A portion, please enter your questions through the Q&A mechanism in Zoom. Since we've already received many questions from students and faculty, I will limit repetition by grouping similar questions together. Please note that anonymous questions are not permitted. Let me now briefly introduce our distinguished panelists. There we are. Seth Carpenter is the chief U.S. economist at UBS. He also has been head of research at Rocos Capital. Previously, Dr. Carpenter served as assistant secretary for financial markets in the U.S. Treasury. That followed a distinguished career as an economist at the Federal Reserve Board, culminating in his role as Deputy Director of the Division of Monetary Affairs. Dr. Carpenter received his PhD from Princeton. Wendy Edelberg is the director of the Hamilton Project and a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution. Previously, she was chief economist at the Congressional Budget Office. She also served as executive director of the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission and worked at the Council of Economic Advisors and the Federal Reserve Board. Dr. Edelberg received her PhD from the University of Chicago. Mark Zandi is chief economist of Moody's Analytics. He is a co-founder of Economy.com, which Moody's acquired in 2005. He serves on the board of directors of MGIC, the nation's largest private mortgage insurer, and is lead director of Reinvestment Fund, which invests in underserved communities. Dr. Zandi frequently testifies before Congress on the economy. He received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. Seth will now begin the presentations, followed by Wendy and Mark. After their brief initial remarks, we'll begin the Q&A session. Over to you, Seth.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Kim. And to everyone in the audience, it's a pleasure to be here. To my co-panelists, Wendy and Mark, both of whom I know well, but respect even more than how well I know them. It's great to be with you. Listening to the introduction of the three of us with doctors in our titles made me wonder about that recent kerfuffle with the Wall Street Journal op-ed page, whether or not we should actually be called doctors since we don't deliver babies. But here we are. I think I wanted to talk a little bit about our current outlook for the economy. I know there are lots and lots of questions that came in that are great, but I wanted to stake out just a little bit of a perhaps slightly different, or at least our take on what's going on with the economy, the key things that we're worrying about as we go through this year. And I have a slide deck, and I was just going to show 3 slides to talk about it. But to set the stage, I think what everyone knows is that we had a massive contraction in the economy last year, most of it happening in March and April. The economy started to recover in May. The Q3 growth rates were off the charts big, but the economy still remains below the level of economic activity that we had before the COVID shock hit. And I think there are lots of questions going on, but the way I think about the near-term outlook, there are 2 main things that will determine it. One is fiscal policy. It's a clear question in Washington, D.C. There's plenty of debate going on right now. Will President Biden get the $1.9 trillion that he's asking for? Will instead the Republican/bipartisan counterproposal of $600 billion be adopted? Are we somewhere in the middle? I think that's going to matter a lot. And then the second one is obviously what goes on with the disease itself. We now have vaccines being rolled out. We saw there was a very, very, very large spike in cases at the end of last year. Those are coming down. And so how are those two going to evolve? So I think the first point that we'll make is we've assumed that there will be a fiscal package that's coming out soon. We had been at the lower end of the range just because we put more weight on the initial comments from President Biden that he wanted bipartisanship and coming together. Clearly, the risk of a only Democratic approach with a larger outcome, that probability seems to be rising and rising and rising. But nevertheless, there's going to be, it seems, some additional boost to the economy coming, delivered sometime in the first quarter, probably now in the month of March, and that's going to help as the economy starts to recover. I think the other key theme, though, the disease, there we have a slightly different take on how to think about things. Vaccines are rolling out now. Depending on what your expectation was beforehand, they're either happening slower than you thought or faster than you thought, or maybe about online. But nevertheless, it's clear that people are getting vaccinated. The Federal Reserve has talked about looking at the rate of vaccinations and how many people need to be vaccinated before they'll feel like the risk to the economy is gone. But I want to push a slightly different view. When we saw COVID cases rising last year in the spring, falling over the summer, and then starting to rise again in the autumn, I think one thing that became clear, and you can see it in the data, is that there's a correlation between the reported number of cases and economic activity, especially in services, and it shows up in, say, the labor market data, either the jobs report or initial claims for unemployment insurance. Moreover, we know, and this is sort of coming out in the past couple of weeks, governors here in New York, Governor Cuomo, in California, Governor Newsom, across the country, the way they've been adjusting their rules, restrictions, and regulations has been on reported cases. So what does that mean? Reported cases are extraordinarily different than some epidemiologists measure of herd immunity. We have had a number of people who have had the disease in the past couple of months, so potentially they have some temporary immunity. We are seeing vaccines rolling out. And moreover, there's been about a 40% asymptomatic rate for COVID, at least in the US. All of that means, to my mind, the decline that we're seeing in COVID cases is likely to continue, and it's likely to progress. And as we get through the month of March, when a large number of the older population will be gone, the morbidity risk, the mortality will be declining in the United States as well. And so when you think about it either as the number of reported cases or the amount of mortality risk in the economy, that's actually going to go away a lot faster than getting to 70%, 65, 70, 75% of the economy vaccinated. And it really does seem that it's the reported cases, the average person waking up in the morning, opening up the newspaper, looking at that line of reported cases that's driving a lot of the economic activity. So in our forecast, consumer spending starts to inflect higher in March and then really surges in Q2 of this year. And that for us is the key shift in the economy where we think things start to pick up. And so we've got a forecast that's pretty strong for this year, 6.75% for the year as a whole. I'm going to share my screen now for a few charts. Oops, let's see. Play. Let me go back to the right. Here we are. So 6.5% or so for the year as a whole. But there you can see, if you look at the very top line of numbers that is in bold, in Q2, we've written down an 11% growth rate at an annualized rate for Q2. So, you know, if everyone took some collective experience with global pandemics that lead to mobility restrictions, you'd have almost one observation. So we could clearly be wrong here, but that is how we've been modeling things, is that consumer spending is going to start to surge again in Q2 as people get more confidence, as COVID cases start to fall and start to go back to spending, especially spending on services, which is the part of the US economy that's depressed. So that's our forecast. Starts to pick up in Q2, boosted by fiscal policy, boosted by very, very low interest rates. The housing market is doing quite well now. lots of manufacturing in the United States is actually doing quite well now. And so what we want to see, what we are forecasting to see is as COVID cases continue to fall, then we look for there to be a pickup in spending that really starts to surge in Q2. And then we get spending going back to sort of its normal relationship with income over the next 4 quarters or so. Somewhat arbitrary assumption, but all the evidence that we have available pushed us very strongly in that direction. So that's where we wanted. Oops, sorry. Just one last point here on that forecast. That's what I want to say about the main forecast. But I guess the other part that's important to note is, in terms of the level of the economy and our forecast, if these numbers are right, in Q2, we will have got back to and in fact somewhat exceeded the level of GDP that we had before COVID. So if you take 2019 Q4 and look at that level, Q2 is the point in our forecast where we exceed that level. But then we still have rather strong growth for the next several quarters. And so we'll be exceeding the pre-COVID level. I think that's an important marker, and I think it's an important milestone to discuss, especially if we start talking about the Federal Reserve and when they might change their QE policy. But I don't think it's anywhere near as significant as might otherwise be imagined, because 2019 Q4 was, of course, about a year, will have been a year and a half ago. And so just getting back to where we were a year and a half ago, if we ever had a period in time where GDP did not grow for a year and a half, we would think that's a really, really crummy period. So yes, it's good to get out of the hole that COVID put us in. It's good to get back to pre-COVID levels of GDP, but that's only a starting point. It's by no means a finishing point. So there are 2 other points I want to make just to prime the conversation. And one is what about the medium-term goals, and the other one's really about inflation, which is a key topic that's been coming up. I want to focus on what's on the left-hand chart here, and that's the labor force participation rate. The blue line is labor force participation for so-called prime age workers. I am increasingly disliking the phrase prime age because it means between 25 and 54 years old. And as of December, I've now only got about 4 more years to be in my prime. But nevertheless, that's what it means. The black line is for the economy as a whole. And the reason to look at them together, or to look at the blue line itself, is because as people get older, on average, they work less. And so you would expect as the US population gets older, the labor force participation rate might decline. But I think there's something that's really important here. Just focus for a bit on the blue line. There's a very clear cyclical pattern here. So if we look at the expansion over the 2000s, if we look at the expansion leading up to the financial crisis, there was a decline in labor force participation just among prime age workers. So abstracting from any demographic shift, started to climb halfway through, and we didn't quite get back to the previous peak. And then the financial crisis hit, the housing market collapsed. And we saw this massive decline in labor force participation. People, you can think of it as people leaving the labor market because the economy is soft. But by the time we got to 2015 and the economy was recovering, people started coming back to the labor market. And it took until January of last year till we essentially got back to the previous cyclical peak. Now you can see scrunched up in the gray, labor force participation has taken another massive hit. One of the key questions that I get from my clients is, what are the long-lasting effects of COVID? And for me, one of the key places to look is, what is it going to do to the labor market? How long is it going to take for those people to come back into the labor market? How long is it going to take so that we have that productive capacity for the economy coming back? And I think that's a key risk there. It's part of what people refer to when they think about possible scarring of the economy, is damage that's either permanent or very long lasting to the labor market. And if we think again about the last business cycle, it took 10 years to get back to the previous peak. For me, 10 years is long enough that I don't worry so much about the difference between temporary and permanent. And then the last point I want to make, just because again, it's a big deal in terms of the conversation, is what's going on with inflation. If we have this contraction in the economy, will we get this big pickup in inflation because we're somehow supply constrained? And my answer is going to be no. And it's going to be a slightly nerdy, technical, and boring answer. But for those of you, especially the students who are thinking about careers in economics, measurement matters. Measurement matters a ton. And so what's on the left little complicated chart. The blue bars are monthly changes. The black line on the left is the 12-month change. So the monthly changes and 12-month change in what? This is the component of inflation that measures the rent of shelter, i.e., if you rent your apartment, if you rent the house you live in, this is rent. If you own the house you live in or the apartment that you live in, this is the amount of rent that the Bureau of Labor Statistics attributes to you that you're effectively paying yourself. In the US, when inflation is measured, house price changes do not, to a first approximation, matter for inflation. What matters is what's going on with the rental market. And what has happened over the course of 2020 is rent of shelter fell and fell and fell and fell and fell. This has the rest of our forecast there. We expect it to be very, very low for at least the rest of this year and probably through the next couple of years. Why does that matter? Because the way the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates the consumer price index, 40%, 2/5 of the entire core PCE or CPI index is this component, rent of shelter. That's low. It's not coming back anymore. And so when you hear stories about, oh, the government is printing money, oh, the government deficit has gone up, oh, the Fed has got interest rates at zero, all of those statements are true. And yet for measured inflation to really skyrocket, especially for it to happen this year, you need to tell a story why everything else that's measured in that index outperforms this very, very important 40% of the index that's coming down and likely to stay low for a while. So that was, oops, how do I stop sharing? There we go. Just a few thoughts from me to try to be a little bit provocative, kick things off, and hopefully teach a little bit. Nerdy technical details of measurement really do matter. And for those of you who want to go into this profession, those are the sorts of things to pay attention to.
I think I'm just supposed to jump right in. So I'm just going to jump right in. So hello, I'm Wendy Edelberg. As Kim very kindly introduced me, I am director of the Hamilton Project. And I apologize, as I sit in this room, the lighting outside is like dramatically changing. And so like I think in a moment or two, I probably will look like I'm sitting in the dark. Hopefully not. So anyway, very happy to be here. I'm going to jump. I'm gonna basically take my comments from a very important point that Seth made, which is that the state of the economy and our projection of the economy going forward is very much dependent on what happens to fiscal policy. And so the Hamilton Project, with our co-authors at the Hutchins Center at Brookings, put out an analysis last week analyzing the economic effects of the proposed package by the Biden administration of $1.9 trillion. And then this week, we just put out, in fact, today, an analysis of the plan proposed by 10 Senate Republicans, totaling $618 billion. So in just a moment, I'm going to show you our analysis of how those two pretty different plans would affect economic outcomes. And you can find all of this on our website. So all the pictures I'm about to show you are available on the Hamilton Project website. Okay, let's see if I can manage sharing my screen. All right, I am going to assume that that is working. And okay, so the first picture I want to show you shows there are a bunch of different lines on this graph. Let me talk you through them super fast. So what you have here is CBO's current law baseline. That is that low line that starts in blue where we have actual data and then becomes a blue dotted line. I should say when we put out this analysis last week, we didn't have CBO's February 2021 projection of GDP under current law, so assuming no additional fiscal support. We had used our own projection of what we thought GDP would be under those conditions over the next few years. And we were pretty close to what CBO projected because we were trying to find a consensus forecast. So anyway, but we swapped in CBO's baseline that they just published. Okay, so that's the bottom line. The top line is CBO's pre-pandemic projection of GDP, so the one that they put out in January 2020. The next line down, the purple dashed line is CBO's current projection of potential output. This is moderately down from their previous projections of potential, taking on board what I'm assuming taking on board some of the persistent effects they expect will be in place because of the pandemic, lowering economic growth over the next few years, but also just taking on board additional information that they've gotten since they put out their potential output forecast in January. Okay, so then the all-important green line. So the green line is our projection of what the economy would look like if the entire $1.9 trillion package were enacted. So we estimate that the Biden package would result in real GDP exceeding its current law baseline by 3.6% at the end of 2021 and 2.1% at the end of 2022. And in addition, you can see that GDP would rise above its pre-pandemic path. And so one way to think about this is that it means that some of the massive reduction in economic activity that we saw since the pandemic struck in, basically the first quarter of 2020, some of that lost economic activity would be made up over time. Now, we also estimate that there would be a pretty sizable positive output gap, so a pretty big difference between the level of real GDP and potential output as CBO currently projects it. That difference would peak at 2.6% in our estimates in the first quarter of 2022. That would most likely put upward pressure on inflation, which the Federal Reserve has made very clear they would welcome. It would also mean that we have to come down the other side of the mountain when growth slows and GDP returns back towards potential. What we've put in here is a pretty smooth, soft landing, if you will. But everybody who writes down soft landings then has to offer the caveat that soft landings are kind of the unicorn that are never found in the actual wilderness. So one should be thoughtful about the fact that this Biden package creates some risks around a possibly harder landing, let's say in 2022. All right. But many of the aspects of the stronger GDP and indeed even the inflationary pressures would of course be welcome. And I should have said from the very beginning that this is only one narrow way to analyze the effectiveness of these two packages. I'm about to show you the Republican package. Of course, the primary way to judge them is whether or not they effectively contain the virus, distribute the vaccine, and ameliorate all of the suffering that we know is happening among the households and businesses that are being affected. So I'm well aware that that is a really critically important way to judge these packages. I'm setting that aside and focusing on GDP. Okay, so now let me move on to what the world we think would look like if the Republican package were passed. So this is the $618 billion package that 10 Republican senators have proposed. So same exact lines, but now you have an orange line, which is our analysis of the Senate Republican package. So this would leave GDP about 0.8% below its pre-pandemic trajectory at the end of both 2021 and 2022. And we would just see real GDP just a touch above potential output as projected by CBO, suggesting less inflationary pressure and less of a hoped for soft landing after we peak. All right, so if I have another minute or two, let me show you how we thought about the different components of the package and just give you a sense of how we did this analysis. So what you can see here is the different major components of the Biden package and how we estimated that those different components would affect GDP. What we essentially did is we took the entire $1.9 trillion and created four, it might be useful for me let me jump ahead to there. We took the entire $1.9 trillion and we divided it into four large buckets, thinking about those buckets about whether or not we could make the argument that the people on the receiving end of that money or the state governments on the receiving end of that money would have basically the same spending response in terms of marginal propensities to consume and the timing of those MPCs within that entire bucket. And where that led us was to divide the $1.9 trillion into one bucket that was COVID containment and vaccination and other aid to states. That's the largest category, $750 billion. Direct aid to families, $600 billion. Aid to financially vulnerable households. I'm assuming you're reading this slide as I'm saying all of this out loud. So I'm just pausing long enough so that you can look at it. Okay, but now let's go back to this. So then we put we model how we think those different categories would affect the economy over the next few years. So the largest effect stems from that roughly $750 billion for COVID containment, vaccination, aid to state and local governments, and increased federal spending. So that's that dark green band. And that's the largest because it's both the largest magnitude of federal outlays, but also because we estimate that that would have a pretty sizable, in a relative sense, a pretty sizable effect on spending. And relative to the other categories, some of the other categories. And so the smallest effect comes from the roughly $150 billion for business aid. That's just that teeny, tiny little dark pink line at the top of the chart, because those outlays are relatively small, but also because we estimate that their effect on GDP is relatively modest per dollar. And then you can also just see the pattern of these estimated economic effects, that they happen over time. Some of them happen pretty slowly over the next few years. And that's what generates the hump in the GDP path and gets you a peak. Well, now I'll come back here, a peak in where we think the level of GDP would be and its peak relative to potential. So that is all I had. I think I hand the baton to Mark. Unless Mark doesn't want the baton.
I'll always take the baton from you, Wendy. Thank you for the baton. I appreciate that. And it's so good to be with you. And Kim, thanks for the opportunity to be with you at NYU, and Seth. It's a pleasure. So thanks for the opportunity. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about my economic outlook. And I'm going to just dive right in and give you a sense of where I think things are headed. I'll share my screen. Maybe I'll see if I can do a little bit better than that. Hold on one second. This might be better. There you go. Okay, so I'm just going to go get right to it. And I think this will give you a clearer sense of where we've been and where we're headed. This is jobs, employment, millions, monthly, January of 2019 through the end of 2024. That's Biden's term. This is my baseline outlook. So this is in the middle of the distribution of possible outcomes. Obviously, there's a lot of uncertainty going forward in a lot of different scenarios, but this is in the middle of the distribution. You can see the recession. It was short, 2 months, March, April. It's hard to believe about a year ago, the pandemic hit. It's been about a year. We lost 22 million jobs in that downturn. In terms of GDP, real GDP, the value of all the things that we produce, peak to trough, we were down about 12%. And for context, if you go back to the very severe financial crisis back a little over a decade ago, GDP peak to trough declined just about 4%. So by that measure, GDP, the pandemic was 3 times as severe. You can see the recovery beginning back in May of last year, extending through December. Things have slowed down quite a bit here in the last couple of months as the pandemic has re-intensified. But we got 12 million of the 22 million jobs that we lost back. So we're down about 10 million jobs. Just roughly, about half of those jobs are lost temporarily. People who are unemployed think they're going to go back to their previous employer once the pandemic is over. And the other half is, I think, more permanent. Those folks don't think they'll be going back. Their employer is no longer with us, or for whatever reason, they permanently lost their job. You can see then where I think we're headed between now and mid-year. I think I'm calling that the pandemic outlook. That is the economy while the pandemic is still on. And this gets to the first key assumption. And that is, I'm assuming that the pandemic will begin winding down by sometime in the second half of the year. In fact, sometime between July 4th and Labor Day, I would anticipate the U.S. economy achieving some kind of herd immunity. That's a combination of vaccinations, which seem to be picking up. And I think with the Biden administration focused on this, we'll see a lot more vaccinations. And of course, a large number of the percent of the population has already been infected and presumably has some form of immunity. The chart here makes it look like the end of the pandemic is some kind of event. One day the pandemic is on, the next day it's not. I don't mean to imply that. It's going to be a bit of a process, I think, and obviously a lot of risk around that assumption, but that's a key assumption. Between now and then, though, we've got very significant cross currents. You've got the headwind of the pandemic. It's doing a lot of damage to the economy. Seth did a really good job of describing that. But you've got the tailwind of policy, monetary and fiscal policy, and in the next 6 or so months, those crosswinds will kind of net out. The economy will continue to avoid going back into recession just because the fiscal support is so substantive, but it's going to be a bit of a struggle, a bit uncomfortable. In fact, I'll go so far as to say is if lawmakers had not passed additional fiscal support at the end of last year, there was a $900 billion package release passed towards the end of December. The economy probably would have gone back into recession, would be in recession right now. We lost jobs in December. We probably would lose jobs and be in recession in the early part of 2021. But fortunately, lawmakers got it together and passed that piece of legislation. The other key assumption here is that we'll get more fiscal support. I think that's clear. It's just a question now of how much support and when. And I'm assuming $2 trillion of deficit financed fiscal support over the course of 2021. I don't think it's going to be all the 1.9 trillion that President Biden has proposed immediately. I think we'll get a couple tranches of fiscal support throughout the year, but that's an assumption and a lot of risk around that. Third key assumption, and this is key to the post-pandemic outlook on the other side, and just how quickly we get back to something we would consider more normal, is just human behavior. How quickly will we all start getting back to doing the kinds of things that we did before the pandemic? Even when the pandemic is winding down, I do sense that people, particularly older groups, baby boomers, me, in households that are wealthier, higher income, where there's a lot of savings and pent-up demand and where a lot of the growth is going to come from, are just going to be a bit cautious. The image I have in my mind is that we've been all in a bunker. We've kind of taken a step out, a couple steps out, and then we run back in when the pandemic intensifies. I just don't see us coming raging out of that bunker quickly. It's going to take us some time to feel comfortable that things are safe and that we're safe and kick into gear. But we will. And you can see in my baseline outlook, I expect to get all the jobs back we lost in the pandemic recession by early 2023. To be precise, and just for precision, May of 2023. So a little over 3 years after the bottom, we'll get those jobs back, all the way back. And that's about when we'll achieve full employment. That's a key date because that's when the Federal Reserve, I think, has told us they'll start raising short-term interest rates off the zero lower bound. Of course, we'll need to see higher rates of inflation also above the Fed's target of 2%, which I think will also be the case by early 2023. Long-term rates will rise well before that time, but the Fed will begin normalizing short-term rates in early 2023. So that's the baseline outlook. Obviously, a lot of assumptions. I only went through several of them. They're the key ones, but there are many others. And as you can imagine, there are many, many different scenarios that I think need to be considered. One other thing I'd like to say before I end is I do think that the pandemic will have what you might call a long tail. I think there are some lasting effects of the pandemic. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but I'm going to mention one, and that is I do think work from anywhere is a fundamental change. And and just to give you a sense of that, prior to the pandemic, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a little under 10% of the workforce worked from home on a consistent basis. In April of last year, at the peak of the shutdowns, 35, obviously I'm rounding, but 35% of the workforce work consistently from their home. We're now down to closer to 25%. And I think that's kind of roughly where we're going to settle. And then it's going to steadily rise going forward as employers begin to figure out how to implement work from anywhere on a more consistent basis. I mean, just thorny kind of human HR issues need to be nailed down. So for example, I live and work in New York. Now with work from anywhere, I can live in anywhere I want. Let's say Tampa, it's cheaper, housing costs are lower, less commute time, lower taxes. But should I get paid New York wages, which is what I'm being paid now, or should I be paid Tampa wages? The answer is probably Tampa wages, but to get from here to there is going to take some time in figuring that out. But work from anywhere, if I'm right, will have very substantive implications for lots of things. You can imagine what it means for real estate, but you can also imagine what it means for regional economic activity. And that's the point of this chart. This is employment for New York City. That's the blue line. And I just picked another area that would likely benefit from work from anywhere. New York City will obviously be diminished by it. Indexed to 100 in the fourth quarter of 2019. And you can see 10 years of history and 10 years of forecast. And the thing I want to point out is that blue line, the slope of that blue line in the next 10 years is meaningfully lower, visibly lower than the slope of the line in the previous 10 years. That's work from anywhere. And of course, Denver would be a beneficiary of that. Not that New York is not going to create jobs, not that New York may not even flourish going forward, but it will be diminished by work from anywhere. So the pandemic obviously has had very massive effects on the economy in the near term, and it will also have a long tail. With that, Kim, I'll stop and I'll turn the conversation back to you.
That's great. Thank you, Mark. And thank you, Seth and Wendy. That was all great. I hope Seth and Wendy will turn your videos back on and we'll all join each other again. So thank you all. Wonderful presentations. And now we'll start with a Q&A. Just a reminder, we do have a lot of Q&A questions that have come in already from students and faculty, but you're welcome to submit questions via the Zoom Q&A. And I see that there are a couple that are already there, and I just thought we ought to start with one. Dick Berner has asked the question, what about the rest of the globe? Most of you focused your points on the United States, and we'll come back to that for sure. But since we didn't talk too much about the rest of the globe, how does the rest of the how does the world outside the United States doing relative to the U.S.? Better, worse? To what extent does it vary across regions? Anybody want to jump in?
I'd be happy to. Or Seth, go ahead. I'll clean up after you. Go ahead.
Wow. Now I feel self-conscious. I was actually going to start off my comments by saying Mark just made me sad. He's one of my all-time favorite economic forecasters, and he's more gloomy than I am, which makes me want to go stick my head in the sand.
Actually, I'm not that gloomy, but yeah.
So I mean, I think internationally, globally, it's a real mixed bag, and it's going to continue to evolve in different ways. I think the international experience to date is very informed by how various countries have handled the pandemic. So parts of Southeast Asia have actually bounced back. China sort of first in many ways, first out. You see Taiwan and even to some extent Korea having handled the pandemic better. So I think in that regard, handling of the pandemic to date has had a material effect on the recovery. I think you see lots of Europe, though, where things are still pretty bad and economic activity is still suppressed. And again, it's a reflection of handling of the pandemic to date. I think looking forward, what's going to matter a lot is how well and how effectively the vaccine can get rolled out. Lots of developed, very rich countries had locked in lots of contracts with vaccine makers for hundreds of millions of doses. Many of the developing economies around the world, the emerging markets, had much less access. And I think we'll have and as a result, in addition to that, have less infrastructure to do the same sort of rollout. And so I think that sort of global inequality is going to play itself out over the next 2 to 3 years as the developed world gets the vaccine rolled out, the emerging market world lags behind. And then just as an extra curveball, one place where I'm sort of interested to see how things evolve internationally is with US and particularly Chinese international trade. So spending in the US, consumer spending in the US fell a lot, as I think everyone knows, but spending on physical goods actually got back to and then exceeded pre-COVID levels of spending. That started to tail off in the past month or two. But there's a big shift in wallet share from services, because who wants to go get a haircut in a pandemic, towards physical goods. I didn't take my kid to Disney World. I bought him 2 Xboxes or PlayStations. Seems to me that wallet share shift is probably going to reverse once the world looks like a safer, better place. And I think that does probably have some implications for global trade and potentially FX markets. Anyway, Mark, your turn to clean up.
You're muted.
Mark, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I've got a dog in the background, so I'm just navigating around that. Hey, I got a really cool chart for you. Hold on one second. Okay, what do you think? This is where different economies. And by the way, hi Dick, how are you doing? I haven't heard. What are you up to? I'd love to know what's going on. It's good to hear your name. But here is our sense of where different countries are in their business cycle. We've got a couple hundred economists around the globe. Each one covers a country, and you can see, as Seth was saying, Asia is kind of leading the way. China, Vietnam, New Zealand are in expansion. That means that they're growing and the level of activity is above pre-pandemic levels. And that just simply goes to they've handled the pandemic well. They locked down hard. They controlled the virus. They've been testing and tracing aggressively since, and they've benefited enormously from that. The rest of the developed world, US, Canada, much of Europe, at risk of going back into recession, and that's because we've bungled the pandemic response. The only reason why we're not in recession is because we have used massive fiscal policy and monetary policy to keep us out. But we're right on edge, and some of these economies are going to go in, like the UK, because the pandemic has been so significant, is likely in recession. They contracted in Q4, and they will almost certainly contract in Q1. So Europe is very significant at risk. And of course, many of the emerging markets, they're in red, they're still in recession because they haven't been able to manage the crisis, the healthcare crisis, and they don't have the financial resources to battle it with fiscal policy and monetary policy. So this kind of gives you a sense of it. The global economy is still in a very fragile place.
Can I just add one thing?
Please.
Which is, so Seth ended his remarks talking about the dollar and global trade. And I think one thing to keep in mind as you think about what those trends will look like over the next couple of years, again, comes back to how big the fiscal package might be. With a large enough fiscal package, you could get a surge in aggregate demand that far outstrips the US economy's ability to meet that demand. And you could see more of that demand than we would typically see, like in response to, an increase in fiscal support, more of that demand resulting in imports, and particularly imports from some of those exact same countries that Mark talked about doing pretty well right now.
Great. Well, that actually brings me to 2 sets of questions. Let's start with one. Since we've now considered a few different countries inside the United States and elsewhere, what lessons should we draw from the experience of these various countries about the trade-off between addressing the pandemic and addressing economic objectives? Is there a trade-off? How should policymakers around the world balance those objectives?
Well,
go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I think it's pretty obvious. A necessary condition for any kind of economic recovery is containing the virus. If you can't contain the virus, you're toast. The only reason why we've kind of navigated through even as badly as we have is because we've spent already $3.2 trillion to ensure that we don't completely evaporate. That's the CARES Act, that's the $900 billion COVID Relief Act, and a number of other things in between. And we're going to, do more. Not that I'm saying we shouldn't, we have to, but, the point is it's been very costly. So, and as Seth said, I mean, you can just easily connect the dots between the pandemic. And by the way, Seth, I have found hospitalizations are more closely linked to economic activity. And it's not difficult to do. You can look at it across country. You can look at it across state. It's very visible. When the pandemic is raging, an economy cannot function well.
What I find incredibly frustrating about the trade-off implied in that question is that trade-off should have really only been most salient in the months right after the pandemic struck. So that was a time when we were purposefully contracting, disrupting economic activity, telling people to stay home, but we didn't use that time wisely. Like that time was then, if we were being effective with that time, we would have put in place all of the precautions that would have allowed a lot faster resumption in economic activity even before the vaccines were distributed. And now, once again, it's still a frustrating trade-off to imagine, because still again, we could be putting in place all sorts of effective responses to keep the pandemic from surging and now get the vaccine distributed. So at this point, this should not be, in our minds, a trade-off.
Yeah, I'll just echo both of what was said. And at some point, there probably has to be a trade-off, but the best, in some perverse way, that's probably the best version of the world to be in, where there has to be a trade-off, because I think, related to Mark's comment about hospitalizations and Wendy's point about not having used the initial shutdown very well, there was clearly a big chunk of time, call it, the late third quarter, early fourth quarter of last year, where we weren't doing very well at containing the virus. And because of that, the economy was suffering. And if instead there had been much more aggressive testing and tracing, mask mandates and enforcement, you could have had a both and. You could have had better health outcomes and better economic outcomes. And it's only when you get to the limit of, where those sorts of precautions are at their absolute limit, then you're back to sort of where there could be potentially a trade-off. But that would be a good place to be if you could get back to the point where you're really at that efficient frontier. And we were just nowhere near that in the third quarter and fourth quarter.
Or now.
Understood. So one of the things that I took away from all your comments, everybody's forecasting a pickup in the economy, maybe a little faster for Seth, maybe a little slower for Mark. And part of that depends on the development in the pandemic. But one very obvious takeaway is no one's worried about inflation. And in fact, the entire role of monetary policy seems like a sideshow in all this description. Am I missing something? Is monetary policy now just irrelevant compared to fiscal policy?
So let me jump in, and there are probably other views as well. No, I think is the short answer. It's not irrelevant. And if we think about what monetary policy has done historically, first, it's in very interest sensitive sectors, and then you start to see multipliers from there. So not a lot of the economy is directly interest sensitive. It takes a lot of change in the cost of capital to get businesses to invest more. Normally, they just like to see more demand for their product before there's additional investment. But the housing market, the housing sector, typically, historically, very interest sensitive, and it's booming right now. So in that regard, monetary policy is doing a lot of what you would expect it to do. I think one of the great crimes of the economics profession, at least academically, and I have to tar myself for being partly responsible for when I was an academic, is to talk about inflation as being a quote unquote monetary phenomenon, and somehow some particular measure of a monetary aggregate is going to inexorably lead to inflation. That's just wrong, at least for the United States, for reasons that we can get into if it's useful. Where one could quibble a bit about what the Fed's doing, how effective it is. I think there's an argument to be made that in a pandemic, there's probably an attenuation of how effective monetary policy is. I think that's fair. I think given how low short interest rates are generally and globally, being able to push the 10-year yield down another 20, 30 basis points, which I will say, when I was at the Fed working on monetary policy strategy in 2008, 9, 10, 11, 12, coming out of the Great Recession, those are the ranges of ability to affect the 10-year that we were talking about. Could we do enough asset purchases, enough QE to push it down 20, 30, 40 basis points? From where we are now, one could be excused for being quite skeptical that that's going to have a material difference. So I think monetary policy matters about as much as it had, maybe a little bit less because we're in a pandemic and because interest rates are low, but it still is relevant.
So I'll go super fast. I think monetary policymakers have been very clear that they want to run the economy hot and they want to overshoot their 2% target. So I think that the way we should worry about inflation is that if they can't get that outcome, then what do they do? And that might lead to, some complicated outcomes of its own. So insofar as we should be worried about inflation, like I think our baseline path of if all the outcomes, come to pass as monetary policymakers have said that they want them to, it's an overshoot of probably a couple of tenths is the way I read it. But the only thing that I want to throw in is that while I'm not worried about inflation per se, I am worried about the economy slowing. We don't do a very good job of slowing. So that's intimately linked to inflation, but I just wanted to throw that in.
Hey, Kim, one other quick point about monetary policy that's critical that I don't think the Fed gets credit for, at least in the kind of the popular thinking around this. I mean, everyone focuses on interest rates and housing. It's that I think the Fed had erected a very effective firewall between the chaos in the economy and the financial system through the credit facilities that it established. I mean, it kept credit markets open and allowed credit to continue to flow. And that's one of the key differences between the pandemic and what will be the post-pandemic recovery and the financial crisis and that recovery. I mean, that recovery was significantly impaired because the financial system caved and required a bailout, and it took us many years to sort all of that out. Fortunately, because of the Fed's actions, the financial system has navigated through very, very well and will be a contributor to growth on the other side of the pandemic. So the Fed, there's many different ways that the Federal Reserve's policies have helped to support the economy. That firewall is critically important. I'm just going to throw something out, and I'm not going to say anything except throwing it out. I think inflation is not an issue now, but it's going to be a bigger deal than people think on the other side of the pandemic. I think it's going to be higher than people think, not lower.
Okay. So all of you have talked about the size of fiscal packages. Even the smaller ones still imply a significant further increase in the deficit. We've already gone through a rapid rise in the debt. How should we be concerned about the rapid accumulation of debt in the United States and elsewhere? Is that going to be a problem for fiscal policy, for monetary policy?
Can I start?
Go ahead, Wendy.
We're talking about a temporary surge in federal borrowing. And I think that's a really critical distinction here. And it suggests that as long as we're talking about a temporary surge, no, I don't think that we need to worry. I think that financial markets have proven that they can accommodate temporary surges in federal borrowing. And I think getting a little wonky, I think now the way we're operating monetary policy means that monetary policymakers can make sure that system works well. So I am not worried about temporary surges because I see the level of interest rates and I see what's happening in financial markets. And also, I think you would probably see more concern and worse expectations if we didn't have big packages on the table being discussed, because I think it was Mark pointed out that, or maybe it was Seth, that like we likely would have been in recession right now without the $900 billion package that was enacted in December. That's also on people's minds, so on financial market participants' minds. So I am not at all worried about temporary surge. Yes, someday we need to stabilize our fiscal trajectory, But that's a long way off that we need to worry about that. Not today's problem.
Okay, anybody else?
So I think I agree with Wendy, but perhaps more emphatically, and Kim, the way you asked the question is the way I think the question comes around a lot, which is, are we worried about fiscal space? And I'm old enough to remember 2017, 2018, when the deficit, then people asked the question, do we have enough fiscal space for the next downturn? I think the answer to that question, taking 2017, 2018's initial conditions, has been answered unequivocally. No question. So then, is it a problem? When will it be a problem? And there are a couple different lenses you can look at debt sustainability issues. One is there a level of the debt that would be sort of sustainable, roughly indefinitely? And people often talk about the growth rate of the economy relative to, say, the real interest rate. Real interest rates are just massively negative, right? So the borrowing that's getting done, if you have to pay it back, you're paying it back in real terms less than what you're borrowing. In lots of Europe, clearly they're negative in nominal terms. I have no idea why the German government can't get together, borrow 100 billion euro, spend 10 billion of that with literally no consequence, because they're going to be able to sort of pay things back in smaller terms. So I think in that regard, one really does have to adjust one's view, given the debate about financial stability or fiscal sustainability that came up in the 80s and 90s when real interest rates were positive. The other lens to look at it, again, with that same comparison, is how much is the interest expense on the debt as a share of GDP? In the 80s and 90s, interest expense on the debt was much higher than it is now as a share of GDP. The quantity of debt was much smaller. The price on that debt was much higher. So the 10-year interest rates at about 1%. In the early 80s, even into the early 90s, it was around 8%. So whatever was sustainable then, you should be able to have at least 8 times as much to be able to service the debt without problem.
Mark, did you want to add anything, or?
Well, I agree that we need to use deficit finance fiscal policy to support the economy through the pandemic and get back to full employment as fast as possible. And, these measures that are being taken are, as Wendy pointed out, temporary. They're not adding to our long-term expenditures or affecting the tax code long run. Very different than what, President Trump did, with his tax cuts back in 2018. I agree with all that, but I do think deficits and debt matter, and that once we're back to full employment, we really will need to pivot and start focusing on making sure that we do begin to rein in those deficits and debt. And I'll point out, in the global context, we're not the only one who's borrowing a lot of money. Every country on the planet is doing the same thing. And I would not be surprised at some point down the road, not in 2021, probably not in 2022, but as we're approaching full employment, interest rates pressures are starting to rise in markets in 2023, we will have some kind of sovereign debt event or even crisis. I would be surprised if we don't. And in fact, I'll go even so far to say maybe that's not a bad thing, because I don't think governments can connect the dots politically between what is necessary to make sure that we have sound fiscal situations unless they have higher interest rates to connect those dots with in the minds of the population. I mean, you can't do it. It can't be some kind of theoretical, well, interest rates are going to rise. They have to be rising for people to get it. So that may be what it takes. But I think there's a very high probability that by the way, is one of the other aspects of that long tail of the pandemic I was talking about. This thing is going to have lasting effects, and sovereign debt is going to be one of those issues.
So just to make it more pointed, Mark, are you suggesting we might at some point see a return of the 1970s and 80s bond market vigilantes driving up the interest rate above the growth rate and leading to even faster debt accumulation?
Well, that's a strong statement, but yes, in spirit, yeah, I think the bond vigilantes are going to try to resurrect. They'll be resurrected to some degree, yeah, globally. and they're going to take their vengeance out. Maybe not on the United States because we have more fiscal space than anybody else on the planet, maybe except for China. I don't know. But, certainly in other countries, there is no fiscal space or pretty close to no fiscal space. I mean, you can see what's going on in Italy, Turkey, Russia. There's a long list of countries, even, developed economies that are pretty close. France, Spain, UK, much less fiscal space. So, yeah, I think that'll be the case. And the other thing I'll throw out, just maybe this is maybe a bit nuanced, but historically, when there are events like that, when there's sovereign debt issues or some other debt issue, even the financial crisis, money comes pouring into the United States, right? And that helps us out. That kind of bails us out, right? Because we have low rates and we can take advantage of that. That may not happen this next time around because all these other countries need to borrow significant amounts of money, and they're putting a lot of pressure on their financial institutions to buy the debt of their country. A German insurance companies buying German bonds, Italian banks buying Italian debt. So we're not seeing the same capital inflows in the United States, and maybe we won't in that sovereign debt event. So then, the bond market vigilantes will become more. That resurrection will become more obvious here in the United States as well.
I'd like to offer a more sanguine view than Mark just laid out, just so in hopes that we don't end on that, which is...
Are we close to being done?
No.
Just end our conversation about debt on that.
Oh, okay.
So I think, low interest rates bring risks with them. So low interest rates are very good for obviously lowering the cost of federal borrowing, but low interest rates bring their own risks. And I still think that there's a relationship between deficits and interest rates. And that leads me to think that actually federal borrowing from like 2010 to 2020 or 2019 put upward pressure on interest rates. That upward pressure on interest rates was probably a good thing for our economy. And so then what does this mean for my thinking going forward? I do think higher deficits going forward to finance all of this borrowing that we did will be one of the things that puts upward pressure on interest rates. It's one of the reasons why I think interest rates are going to rise modestly over the next decade. And so I don't foresee us having an event, a crisis, as Mark puts it. That's, I think that's basically a tail event in my thinking. I see there being pressures, and I see if politically we decide over the next decade that we find those net interest costs or those interest costs as a share of GDP really unpleasant, there are lots of steps we can take. We're a big economy with a lot of flexibility. Certainly a lot of flexibility on how we tax ourselves.
Great.
And just to be clear, Kim, I mean, that you're right. That's not your baseline. That would not be my baseline forecast that we have some kind of sovereign debt crisis, but that definitely would be a scenario. I mean, the analog would be the European debt crisis after the financial crisis, right? Same kind of dynamics squared are playing out here. But by the way, one other quick point. In the financial crisis, that was a period of deleveraging. We delevered aggressively. During the pandemic, we have levered, not only sovereign leverage, the sovereign debt, but corporate debt has increased quite dramatically during this period. Household debt has remained the same. So we haven't had the same kind of quote unquote therapeutic, cleansing of the balance sheet that you normally would see coming out of a recession. And that just goes to my angst, on the other side. Not 21, 2022. And again, I'm not saying that's a baseline forecast, but that's certainly a scenario I think policymakers should be considering.
So that actually leads into the next question directly. If we're going to have low interest rates for quite a while, stimulating higher asset prices, should we be worried about fostering future financial instability? Are we essentially creating asset price booms and busts through appropriately stimulative monetary policy?
I've been talking a lot, so I mean, of course, I will keep talking until you stop me. But I'm going to let someone else answer that because that's a great question. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's a very, very, very emphatic maybe there. I think the idea that low interest rates do one thing and high interest rates do something else, high and low is a little bit in the eye of the beholder. So I often shock the 20 and 30 somethings that I work with to let them know that I had a mortgage before I ever had a cell phone. That's hard for lots of people to remember. But what gets to be even more shocking is that my first mortgage was 8.5%. I was actually pretty happy about that.
Way too young for that. Those kind of comments. You're making that stuff up.
I'm telling you, I've only got 4 more years left to be in the prime age category, Mark.
All right.
So, my parents and aunts and uncles thought my 8.5% mortgage was low. Anybody hearing about it now thinks it's ridiculous. If I could buy a 10-year treasury right now at 3%, I'd buy it all day long because that seems like a really, really high interest rate. But when we're in the middle of the 2000s and the Fed only cut interest rates down to 1% for the federal funds rate, and the 10-year was, even higher than 3%, people would have said, "Wow, 3% 10-year, that's so low. It's going to cause all sorts of reach for yield and problems with asset prices." So I think this is one place where the economics profession still needs to do a lot of work, and presumably there's the theory that I learned in graduate school and at some point believed is that there should be some equilibrating mechanism between the marginal product of capital on the one hand and interest rates, and then there should be some risk adjustment across different financial assets that makes it all work fine. What I find shocking, in fact, is and why there might be sort of financial asset price bubbles now, is that if that were to work, it's so hard for me to believe that there does not exist in the United States, let alone globally, any number of investments in non-financial assets and real investments that can beat a hurdle rate of -1% on a risk-adjusted basis. That for me is the real puzzle that the economics profession, I think, needs to tackle is how is it possible that if in fact there are efficient capital markets and we're going to equate the marginal return on capital, blah 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 blah, you don't have more real investments that have a risk-adjusted expected return that can beat zero.
I think that the two critical things there is one, the whole idea of risk adjusted. So I don't think we have a really good sense of premiums, of what they've been since, 2008 and what they continue to be. And the flip side of that is I worry that your question put this too much at the feet of monetary policymakers. So monetary policymakers, obviously, are trying to keep interest rates really low, but the natural rate of interest, I don't know. I'm not going to try to define the natural rate of interest. The natural rate of interest is already really low, and monetary policymakers are somewhat hamstrung, or maybe I shouldn't even say somewhat, are hamstrung by that. And so part of it is yes, those policymakers want to run the economy hot. Running economy hot comes with risks. But part of it is that they are responding to really low natural rates of interest. And we have to do more to figure out why those natural rates of interest are so low, what's happening to risk premiums, why they seem to be so very large. And again, like this just comes back to more federal borrowing pushes those up, or at least should, when at least we're back to full employment, and that could be a good thing.
Mark, anything to add on that one?
Well, I do think we were focused on the liability side of the balance sheet, debt. And I think that is a significant, meaningful threat on the other side of the pandemic. Now we're focused on the asset side of the balance sheet. And I think that is a meaningful threat on the other side of the balance sheet, on the other side of the pandemic. I do think the Fed is fighting like hell to try to support the economy along with fiscal policy. And one of the unfortunate consequences of that is it's driving up asset prices, and it is beginning to engender speculation, might be too strong a word, but we're getting into that kind of realm of just look what happened in GameStop. I mean, just focus on that for a second. And, you get a sense that markets are, the fact that Robinhood, the platform for trading, is booming is symptomatic of, a speculative, frothy kind of over the top kind of market. And so I do think we're starting, and by the way, it's every asset market. It's not just we're focused on equities today. Go take a look at the housing market. Seth brought that up, but house prices are surging. I mean, nationwide across the entire market, they're almost up double digit, year over year up double digit. And, that means in some markets, they are well up into the double digits, right? So that's well above income growth. That's well above rent growth. That's well above construction costs, all the things that some people would look at to try to, put a stake in the ground and say, this is the fair value for, a home. Take a look at commodity markets, price of silver, price of gold. Take a look at cryptocurrency, Bitcoin and Ethereum. This is an issue. This is a problem. I mean, up to this point, it's not. I've not been worried about it because there are benefits actually to that. We all feel a little bit wealthier, and we're going to not spend. We're already saving a boatload. Maybe we save a little bit less, but we're all feeling pretty good about it. But I think we're getting to a point when this is becoming an issue, and it does show the limits of monetary policy, and also potentially make it very difficult for the Fed to execute on the framework it's put in place. Its framework that we've all been talking about is they're not going to raise short-term rates until we're at full employment, whatever that means, but we'll know it when we see it. And inflation is above target on a consistent basis, which is 2%. But they may not be able to get there, if asset prices continue to move north. That's another element in that calculation. So I think this is a significant, meaningful issue that, I'm not saying the Fed's doing anything wrong or isn't doing anything that it should be doing. It's doing exactly what it should be doing. But, there are consequences to that and downsides to that. And asset prices are a good example of it.
So, talking about whether the Fed is doing what it should be doing, it was extremely aggressive last March in reintroducing virtually all the tools that it created back in the crisis of 07-09 and adding more. And particularly adding more in areas like providing funds funds to non-financial entities, to non-financial corporations, to munis. The question I have is really a long-run question, which is when you get involved in providing credit to such politically sensitive entities, is it going to be difficult for the Fed to get out of that? Is it going to be of course, they've done very little of it, but the fact that they've crossed that border, is it going to be a threat to their independence over time?
Absolutely. I think there's no question there. As the saying goes, the only thing harder in Washington than starting a program is stopping one. And I think now the mindset has changed, and there will be any number of calls for the Fed. I think exacerbating that is the design of the program and the interaction with the Treasury. So they put a backstop in for the corporate debt market going down to to speculative grade debt. Clearly for municipal markets, but they had to think a couple of times about how to do that because they had to pick winners and losers in some sense for who qualified and who didn't. But when it comes to, the corporate bond market, already existing deep liquid market, they went in and they lifted a bunch of people out of really, really bad positions and enriched lots of people. So one argument is, what else are you going to do? You're in a crisis. You have to fix things. Okay, that's fine. Then the question becomes, what does one do when you're no longer in a crisis? And I think that for the Fed in particular, in this case, along with the Treasury, but the whole public sector more generally, it's such a short memory. Things go haywire. Things go pear-shaped. We have frictions. We have a breakdown. People step in and fix it. And then after things are solved, completely forget about the fact that this was a problem before. And everyone says, well, there's nothing the Fed could have done. These are the sorts of things that happen very infrequently, and you have to step in. And I don't think that's true. I think it's incumbent on on the entire sort of public sector, the Fed, but then folding that up to the Congress, because ultimately the Congress has authority here, that if we're going to sanction these sorts of bailouts that are not anywhere near as infrequent as people make them seem, there needs to be a reckoning to sort of restructure things so they happen better. And I think adding to that potentially populist fire is then when it came to the Main Street lending facility, it was intentionally structured to fail It was intentionally structured so that not only would the Fed not take a loss, which legally they have to structure it so that there's no expectation there, they structured it, and former Secretary Mnuchin is on record as having said that, structured it so that an expected value, even the Treasury wouldn't take a loss when the Congress literally appropriated $454 billion intentionally for the Treasury to put at risk. And so the asymmetry of who benefits from this power versus who doesn't, I think, is going to come back to haunt the whole political system. And I think the inability of Washington collectively to deal with these sorts of very important systemic issues, and yet keep coming back in and bailing out Wall Street and enriching people who are already wealthy, I think that is a very grave problem.
Anybody else?
I think that point that Seth made at the end about the really frustrating interactions between Treasury and the Fed, I think are really key to worrying about this going forward. I was immensely frustrated by it, and it kind of suggested that like the Treasury was trying to run, like Treasury just should have been hands off. Like Treasury should have said, we were appropriated money here. You do what you think is best. And instead, it kind of felt like they were trying to run fiscal policy through the Fed. And that's obviously problematic.
And keeping it off the balance sheet of the United States and on the Fed's balance sheet.
Yeah.
So actually, it's an opportunity to turn to some longer run issues. And so let me just, a couple of them came up. Mark raised the point that there'll be some long tails of the pandemic. And he mentioned the idea of working from home as a pretty big structural change. Does anyone want to add to that? Other structural changes that you think will be a result of this pandemic shock and the recovery that we're going through?
Oh, I definitely think that there'll be big changes, and I'll give an advertisement for a few pieces actually that are on the Hamilton Project's website. For example, a piece by David Otter and a co-author. I want to be able to say her name, but I'm scared Liz. Anyway, I feel bad that I can't remember her name. Anyway, maybe somebody could look it up while I'm talking. Anyway, so they put out a piece in July actually talking about how we're probably going to see a very serious acceleration in automation coming out of this pandemic. Businesses are not going to unlearn what they've already learned. And if any business if any grocery store was thinking about putting in automated checkout machines, they've probably accelerated those plans. So, and the work from home, the increase in work from home that Mark talked about, I mean, that's not just going to change how businesses function, but it's also going to change how cities function and how the service sector functions. And these don't have to be seismic changes where like cities are no longer recognizable or work's no longer recognizable to have really disruptive effects on the labor market. They can be changes that sort of, change 5% of the labor market. They can be changes around the edges where everything kind of looks recognizable, but still have pretty seismic effects on how the labor market works over time.
I'll agree with that, and I think it to follow on with the way that Wendy was talking about it. There are certain trends that were ongoing that COVID accelerated, and so I think some of the automation in retail that Wendy talked about. If you look at 2016 and into 17, employment in the retail sector more broadly was actually declining, and for all sorts of reasons, the shift to online sales, et cetera. There's a bit of a reprieve with the Tax Cut and Jobs Act because the retail sector across all of the corporate sector was pretty tax inefficient. So they actually got a bigger tax cut in effect than some of the other parts of the economy where there were more ways to sort of defer taxes. But that was just a one-time level shift. The trend was pretty clear. And so now if you do a plot of retail sales, but you look at the share that's online, that was trending up over time. Around 2013, it started to accelerate. Sure enough, the retail sector started losing employment. The pandemic hit and boom, it goes off the chart. I think the limits there are just by how many trees can be converted into cardboard boxes with Amazon's little smile on the side. But I find it hard to believe that trend in spending is going to get reversed post-COVID. What I think instead happened is that we just sort of pulled forward, sort of capitalized a couple of years of that trend that was going to be there. And with it, when we get the recovery in the economy, that's likely to happen, retail sector employment, I'd be shocked if it ever goes back to pre-COVID levels, just because that trend was there and we accelerated it.
I'll mention
Elizabeth Reynolds.
Thank you.
I'll mention two impacts of the pandemic that I think have long tails. Two other things. First is business travel. That will be affected. Now I'm speaking as a business person. I have a couple hundred, 250 economists, statisticians, data people that are in my world at Moody's. After comp and rent, our biggest expense was travel, and we're not going back to traveling the way we did before. I would, travel off my offices in Prague or Dubai or Singapore because I had to be, these are folks that work for me and I need to be there. I don't need to do that. In fact, I get on a call like this, a Zoom call, and I have people from all over the world in that call, and I can't tell where they're from or it's completely broken down the barriers, in our organization. And there's no way I'm going to go back traveling the way I did before. And I can't imagine any other large multinational organization traveling the way they did, before the pandemic. And that has all kinds of implications for cities, for industries, for, many things. The other thing I'll mention that I think is important, and here I'm saying this with a little less confidence, because I haven't dug as deep as I probably should, but I'll throw it out, is I think the pandemic has concentrated market share in the hands of fewer and fewer companies across lots of industries. Seth brought up retail. That's the poster child, right? All these mom and pop retailers have failed. Kind of publicly traded mid-sized retailers have gone bankrupt, and the big guys, and the names, the Walmarts and the Targets and the Home Depot and Lowe's, they're feasting on this. They're gaining market share. And I think that's a symptomatic of what's going on in lots of different industries. And that's one reason, going back to a point I made earlier, I think inflation is going to be higher than people think, because on the other side of this pandemic, these companies are going to use their market power. And, some of the dynamics that weighed on inflation pre-pandemic are not going to post-pandemic. Pre-pandemic, it was all about China and outsourcing and long supply chains and lowering costs. That is not what's going to happen on the other side of the pandemic. In addition to the pandemic, you've got the conflict between the China and the United States, which is not going to go away anytime soon. That will be a feature of our future for many years to come. And I do think companies are going to reduce their supply chains to reduce risk, and that's going to raise costs. So I sense that these kinds of dynamics mean, and these are the result of the pandemic, are going to mean higher rates of inflation than people are counting on going forward.
So, Mark, I completely agree with you about the market power. Those firms with greater market power are also going to use that power with regards to their own suppliers and with regards to labor markets. So, just to say, those have their own effects on prices.
Yeah, but if you can speaking as a business person, if you can raise prices, you will raise prices. And every single year, and everyone gets accustomed to it, right? If you're charging 2% per annum, and then you go 3% per annum, and you do it for a couple of years, you will be charging 3% per annum forever until something changes. So a business person that's great about labor, that's great about lowering costs, but if I can raise prices, I'm raising prices.
So let me turn to a political economy question. We live in a very divided society. There have been arguments that it's been more divided in the past. I'm sure that's true, but there are a lot of signs of division. To what extent is that affecting economic and market prospects in the United States? The fact that we have this very serious political division.
Oh, that's funny. I thought you were going somewhere else, because I would turn the causality, at least initially, in the opposite direction. So again, I had the labor force participation rate chart up before. And what I think a lot of people like to do is sort of connect the peak to the peak to the peak and sort of say that's sort of the structural long-term demographic evolution of labor force participation. But I'm a little bit skeptical there. I think people should expect things to be able to get a little bit higher, especially for prime age. And part of what we're seeing is a prolonged cyclical, semi-structural economic implication. So what do I mean specifically? So 2000-ish, the ascension of China to the WTO, the globalization that Mark was talking about, the hollowing out of American manufacturing, the fact that people running trade policy forgot the second half of the theorem that we're supposed to teach undergraduates about when free trade is good, i.e. it's good as long as you redistribute. That played a huge role between that automation without the sort of additional policy for training, right? So what do we learn about the first welfare theorem of economics? Free markets are good, but it only counts when there aren't spillovers. Well, the education market is sort of not the poster child for sort of like an efficient market. So I would have said that what's happened is the evolution of economic developments, economic policy that have exacerbated the income and wealth inequality have led to a non-trivial amount of this polarization politically, and as a result, the ability to exploit, whether through sort of consistent narrative or not, that sort of economic hardship and that economic sort of rivalry and tension. So I actually think it goes in that direction. But then it does feed back on itself. And I always think about this in sort of market terms of convexity. So what begets what and causes an acceleration. So you get bad, in my view, economic policy that leads to painful economic outcomes, which leads to certain political choices, which then turn to bad economic policies, which lead to worse economic outcomes and worse political outcomes, which sort of, and you really need some specific, very clear-eyed, conscious shift to break that cycle. And, I'm hopeful right now. We'll see what actually happens.
Anybody else? So I'd like to take this moment to pose one final question that ought to be of interest to the students in our audience, who probably predominate. And since the three of you are somewhat far along in your careers, I'd like you to think back and answer the question, what advice you would have to give students who are thinking about having a career in economics or economic or financial research or in finance more generally?
I'll start. So I suggest lean into your comparative advantage. I've had and I partly say that from, I say that as a person who's had a pretty eclectic set of jobs as an economist. And each one of the jobs that I've had, I've realized I think I'm doing a better job of doing just that, of leaning into my comparative advantage. So I'm a great economist. I'm a very good researcher. if I were in an academic department, I don't think, I would be internationally known within, that circle of people. But, I'm able to communicate, I'm able to write, I'm able to manage. When I'm hearing my resume, it sounds like I'm interviewing for a job, but find your collection of skills that you think make you unique, even if that's not necessarily even if it's not like being the very best person at finance. Like, you can be a really good person at finance and then find all of the other skills that actually leverage that up.
Great. Anybody else want to jump in?
Well, you better like it, because like anything else, it's about 10,000 hours. If you want to be good, it's 10,000 hours. There's no way, in my view, around it. So you can't put 10,000 hours into anything unless you really, really like it. And I can tell these guys really, really like it, because we could be doing this for another 3 hours. That's how much we like it. So, if you hung out here for an hour and a half and you want more, and that means maybe I can do the 10,000 hours, then I suggest you do it.
Seth, the final word?
Fair enough. So I clearly agree with what they both said, and maybe my advice is a synthesis of the two of them. So you better like it, I think, is a good bit of advice, especially if you're thinking about doing a PhD in economics. The first 2 years are just, brutal, taking you back to the middle-aged monastic tradition of academia. But after that, I mean, it's still a lot of work, and so you better want to do it. But within that, economics and even finance can be so many different things. And here I'll think more narrowly about just economics. Don't let other people's expectations or definitions about what economics is define what you're curious about. There was a time decades ago where economists weren't asking questions like, what's the relation? Well, when they were asking about the relationship between economic inequality, income inequality, wealth inequality, and economic growth, there was for a long time a pretty received wisdom that it went in one direction, that you had to have inequality in order to get growth. Whereas, now there's a whole range of people who are arguing opposite directions, that in fact you can get better equality and better growth outcomes, or even more provocatively, that letting inequality get worse actually causes worse macroeconomic outcomes. The field is painfully slowly evolving, but it is evolving. And so the part of economics that captures people, the interactions between people, allocation of resources, assignment of prices or value to things, all of that is in bounds. And so if you're really passionate about those sorts of things, it exists in economics. And I would, if you really like it, don't let other people's definitions slow you down.
Thank you all. I want to, I'm sure that the audience joins me in thanking our distinguished panelists for this excellent session. And in a few days, we expect to post a video of today's program on the website of the Center for Global Economy and Business at Stern. Let me close by saying we also hope to see you as guests again at upcoming center events. On March 25th at 1 p.m., we'll host a fireside chat with Dr. Isabel Schnabel, a member of the ECB Executive Board. And on April 22nd at 5 p.m., Dr. Henry Kaufman will join us to discuss his forthcoming book. That chat will be followed by a panel of leading experts discussing Dr. Kaufman's enduring influence on market economics. Once again, thank you to our distinguished panelists, and thank you to the audience. That's a wrap.